All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We are tackling a literal multi-billion-dollar question today. How exactly do institutional investors spot the emerging leverage points in the AI ecosystem before the rest of the market catches on? We're going to track how economic gravity behaves and, more importantly, how you can track its movements at a much higher resolution. So, let's get into it.
Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll be covering the evolution of attention, then drilling into layer 2, looking at the energy infrastructure constraint, defining assessment versus prediction, and finally wrapping up with the fixed stack framework. Moving right along? To really ground this analysis, we got to start with the macro architecture, the fixed 5-layer machine economy stack. Now, as we've established in previous explainers, these 5 structural dependencies, moving from physical inputs down at layer 1 all the way up to identity and settlement at layer 5, those are totally fixed. They do not change. But you know what does change? Economic gravity. Gravity represents where leverage, constraints, and value capture are all concentrating, and it's in a constant state of flux. It's constantly traveling between these layers as new bottlenecks emerge and eventually get solved.
Which brings us to Section 1, the evolution of attention, where we're tracking the migration of capital from intelligence down to infrastructure.
It's honestly fascinating to look back and track how investor focus has migrated. Think back to Phase 1, which was completely dominated by models and intelligence at Layer 3. You remember the launch of ChatGPT, right? It hit 100 million users in 2 months and just sparked this absolute retail frenzy. The whole public conversation was entirely fixated on the intelligence itself. But then sophisticated institutional capital started asking a slightly different question. If these reasoning systems need so much compute, where on earth is all that compute actually coming from? That realization triggered Phase 2, a massive migration of attention down to Layer 2, the physical compute infrastructure. And now? Well, now we're entering Phase 3, which is going to require some significantly higher resolution analysis.
Because here's the thing, the fact that AI needs a massive physical foundation, the semiconductors, the data centers, the huge cooling systems, that's not a secret anymore. It's a heavily capitalized mainstream consensus trade. And because Layer 2 is common knowledge, just knowing it's there isn't going to give you an edge. The next big opportunity, it requires us to look a lot deeper.
Which leads us to a really critical question. If compute is the primary bottleneck for artificial intelligence, what exactly bottlenecks the compute? Let's get into Section 2, drilling into Layer 2. We're utilizing sublayer resolution here to identify emerging blind spots.
By applying this concept of resolution as our analytical tool, we start to see that Layer 2 isn't just one giant monolith. Actually, energy and computation are a tightly coupled system made up of highly distinct, measurable sublayers. Now, the goal here isn't to overcomplicate the map, it's to make the stack a much sharper tool so we can pinpoint blind spots way before the broader market does.
So when we crank up that resolution, these critical sublayers start to emerge. You've got 2A, energy infrastructure, and 2B, compute, then flowing right down into 2C, cooling, 2D, network connectivity, and 2E, security and resilience. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Rather than treating AI infrastructure as just one big homogeneous theme, smart allocators need to pinpoint exactly where that gravity is concentrating within these very specific nodes.
All right, Section 3, the energy infrastructure constraint. We're looking at the shift from acquiring accelerators to supplying electricity. Based on the evidence we have right now, we are observing a really strong candidate for gravity migration. The dominant constraint increasingly looks like it's shifting away from sublayer 2B, that's the GPUs, the servers, the actual data centers, and moving directly towards sublayer 2A, the energy infrastructure. Think about it. Before compute infrastructure can even turn on, it absolutely needs the energy infrastructure beneath it to support it.
The whole narrative is shifting. The most pressing question for AI deployment isn't just can we manufacture enough chips or can we build a massive data center shell. The real biting constraint, the thing keeping people up at night, is generating, transmitting, and actually delivering enough electricity to power the whole shebang. Sophisticated investors are already zeroing in on these precise physical grid constraints with a real sense of urgency. We are talking about raw power generation capacity, the hard limits of transmission networks, massive grid interconnection delays, bottlenecks in just getting your hands on basic transformers, and overall energy reliability metrics. This right here is exactly how gravity announces itself. It shows up as specific, measurable constraints long before it ever becomes a headline on mainstream financial news. Moving to Section 4,
Assessment versus prediction. Here, we're enforcing the boundary between structural frameworks and market observations. It is absolutely vital to maintain some analytical rigor here and enforce a strict boundary. We have to separate the permanent structural utility of our framework from what are essentially temporary observations. Look, the framework's structural claim is simply that Layer 2 can be systematically assessed at a higher resolution. That's a fixed reality. On the other hand, the idea that economic gravity is migrating towards sublayer 2A right now, well, that's a current assessment based on today's evidence. The framework itself remains totally intact, regardless of whether that specific assessment turns out to be right or wrong in the long run. As the source text brilliantly puts it, that is not a prediction. It is a current assessment and a candidate interpretation of the available evidence, and that's key. We are tracking institutional investigation here. We are not trying to prophesy market outcomes. We're just noticing the questions the smart money is asking before the shift becomes obvious. Which brings us to Section 5, the fixed stack framework. Let's look at why exactly the macro architecture resists complexity. Now, you might be wondering, if energy and compute are both so incredibly critical, why not just split them into separate macro layers? Why not just add a layer 6? Well, because a map that grows every single time the terrain becomes more detailed eventually stops being a useful map. It's like a giant puzzle that never ends. The real strength of the machine economy stack is that it completely resists that temptation. The stack has to remain fixed, so we can identify those broad dependencies. We only increase the resolution when the analysis explicitly demands it. And we've got to remember that gravity never stands still. It constantly follows whichever constraint is limiting progress at that exact point in time. So if the energy constraints at 2A are eventually resolved, the bottleneck is inevitably going to migrate again. The framework projects it'll likely move back up to layer 3 as models and autonomous software agents scale even further. From there, it'll progress to layer 4 as physical embodiment and robotics mature, and eventually it'll flow right into layer 5 as complex questions around identity, settlement, and liability become the primary constraints. So the macro layer tells us the theme, right? It tells us where to look. Zooming in with higher resolution tells us what specific opportunity to look at. But that leaves us with a pretty provocative structural question. How do we systematically measure this movement before it becomes obvious to everyone else? How do we distinguish true forward-looking analysis from just comfortable hindsight storytelling? Well, that exact question is the focus of the next briefing in this explainer series, which introduces the concept of scoring gravity. It provides a really disciplined method for allocators to score those dependencies and actually find alpha before consensus forms. Thanks so much for joining me today. As we've seen, the AI stack is fixed, but gravity is always on the move. So the question you've got to ask yourself today is this: while the rest of the market is fighting over computer chips, are you positioned for the reality of the power grid?